Georg Friedrich of Baden-Durlach was Margrave of Baden-Durlach from 1604 until his abdication in 1622. He also ruled Baden-Baden. He was the third son of Margrave Charles II of Baden-Durlach and his second wife, Anna of Veldenz. He was the youngest of 8 children and was only 4 years old when his father died. He succeeded his brother Ernest Frederick as Margrave in 1604. He also continued his brother's occupation of Baden-Baden. Georg Friedrich was a prominent member of the Protestant Union. He raised an army of 12,000 men at the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1618, and defeated the imperial troops of Tilly near Wiesloch in 1622. But a few days later he himself was defeated in Wimpfen, and his army was destroyed. In 1627 he joined the Danish army. He died at Strasbourg in 1638. Early life. Georg Friedrich was born in Baden to Charles II, Margrave of Baden-Durlach and Anna of Veldenz. Georg Friedrich was 4 years old when he inherited the Margraviate of Baden-Durlach, necessitating a regency. The regents were his mother Anna, Elector Palatine Louis VI, Count Palatine Philip Louis of Neuburg, and Duke Louis III the Pious of Württemberg. Early rule in 1584. His brothers Ernest Frederick and James and his mother took over the guardianship. In 1595, Georg Friedrich was declared an adult, and he took up government himself. Education. Georg Friedrich learned the Latin, French and Italian languages and received his higher education in Strasbourg, where his brother James had studied earlier. Travel. He went on a grand tour to Besançon, Dole, Basel and Siena, division of the Margraviate of Baden-Durlach. His brothers were declared adults in 1584. Ernest Frederick and James wanted to divide the inheritance, although the father's testament forbade this. However, the testament had not been properly signed and sealed, and the remaining guardians held that this meant that they could allow the brothers to divide the Margraviate. Ernest Frederick received Lower Baden, including the main towns Durlach and Pforzheim. James received the Margraviate of Hachberg, being given Baden-Durlach. Georg Friedrich retained the southern parts of Baden-Durlach, the lordships of Rotteln and Badenweiler and the county of Sausenberg. Thus, the Margraviate was fragmented further after the earlier split into Baden-Baden and Baden-Durlach, reuniting Baden-Durlach. When James died in 1590, Baden-Hachberg fell back to Ernest Frederick, who gave it to Georg Friedrich in 1595. When Ernest Frederick died in 1604, Baden-Durlach was reunited under Georg Friedrich, ruler of Upper Baden 1595 to 1604. Upon reaching adulthood, Georg Friedrich became the ruler of Upper Baden. At first, he ruled from Rotteln Castle. In 1599 he moved his residence and the entire national administration to Sulzburg, after the conversion of his brother Ernest Frederick to strict Calvinism. Georg Friedrich remained a Lutheran and founded his own Latin school in his small residence Sulzburg, so he would not have to depend on the Calvinist school in Durlach for the education of pastors in his territory. He constructed several buildings in Sulzburg, among them a real tennis hall. Between 1600 and 1610, he built the castle church in Sulzburg. Opening new regulations in 1603, he issued a forestry regulation for the Margraviate of Sausenberg and the lordship of Rotteln. The preacher on the throne. Shortly after he took office in Upper Baden, Georg Friedrich introduced Johann Weininger as the new general superintendent at the Synod of Rotteln. On this occasion he held a speech that resembled a sermon. Interests in the Bible. His life was marked by an ascetic lifestyle. For the handwritten notes in his personal Bible, one can deduce that he has fully read through it at least 58 times. In 1601, he promised the citizens of Pforzheim, who resisted the appointment of reformed clergy by his brother Ernest Frederick, that he would support them when the case came before the Reichskammergericht. Religious issues. In 1613, he had a religious dispute with Duke Francis II of Lorraine. He intended to argue the issue himself. This failed, however, when Francis, against an earlier agreement, sent Jesuits to argue the Catholic side of the dispute. Legislative and administrative reform. Georg Friedrich laid the foundations for a sound administration. He established the Privy Council, which he presided himself. He created a high court and introduced a church order, opening the civil code in Baden. He initiated the codification of the Civil Code of Baden. The resulting statute has been described as the most thorough of any of the German territorial states. It was published in 1622, but due to the 30 Years' War, it could not be brought into force until 1654, under his son and successor Frederick V. It remained in force until 1809. Interests in hunting. Georg Friedrich had big interests in hunting, going out several times a week and hunting for big creatures. The banker and political economist. As early as 1603, Georg Friedrich founded, in cooperation with the estates of Upper Baden, an exchange bank, which also managed orphans' pensions and later developed into a deposit bank. This bank was also meant to organize the trade in wine and grain and eliminate Jewish merchants. It also helped the Margrave to overcome the market crisis of the Kipper and Wipper period, making coins and other forms of currency. Georg Friedrich made many coins and other kinds of currency during his reign. The military theorist. Georg Friedrich saw the deteriorating situation in the empire, and in his own principality in particular, and studied not only theological, but also military themes. He was informed the Knight Academy the Count John VI of Nassau-Dillenburg had founded in Siegen in 1616. Between 1614 and 1617, Georg Friedrich wrote a treatise on modern warfare for his sons Frederick, Charles and Christopher. This treatise was never published in print. Georg Friedrich and the Parliament. Georg Friedrich was aware that he could achieve his goal of a united Lutheran Margraviate of Baden only with the support of the people, in return for approval of taxes to finance his defense policies. He conceded to the estates the right to have a say in religious questions. Early years of the 30 Years' War under Catholic influence. The ongoing court case before the Reichskammergericht about the ongoing occupation of Upper Baden threatened against Georg Friedrich in 1622. He reacted with an armed intervention in the Bohemian Revolt, a conflict that formed the initial phase of the 30 Years' War. Before the Battle of Wimpfen, in 1608, Georg Friedrich joined the Protestant Union. He was appointed as a general of the Union until it was dissolved in May 1621, forming alliances with certain districts. On the 19th of August 1612, Georg Friedrich concluded a defensive alliance with the Protestant cities of Bern and Zurich, with which he wanted to protect Upper Baden, as it was enclosed by territories belonging to Further Austria. When the war broke out, his allies failed to provide military assistance. However, the alliance did enable Georg Friedrich to recruit mercenaries in Switzerland in 1621 and 1622. The Bishop of Speyer, Philipp Christoph von Sautern, felt threatened by the surrounding Protestant powers and Wimpfen in 1615. He began expanding his residence in Udenheim into a fortress. He changed the name Udenheim into Philipsburg and began constructing Philipsburg fortress, despite protests by the imperial city of Speyer, the electorate of the Palatinate and the Margraviate of Baden. In 1618, Elector Palatine Frederick V, Georg Friedrich and the city of Speyer decided to raise the fortress. It was nevertheless completed in 1623, blocking paths from March to June 1620. Georg Friedrich blocked the road from Breisach to Freiburg by order of the Protestant Union, operating from a fortified camp at Eiringen. The goal was to prevent the passage of mercenary troops of Bavaria and the Catholic League from the Alsace to their assembly points at Lauingen and Dillingen on the Danube. Nevertheless, after Emperor Ferdinand II gave assurances that certain troops had been recruited for himself and not for Bavarian Catholic League army, Georg Friedrich allowed the 3 regiments to pass and had to put up with being called naive when these regiments joined the army of Duke Maximilian I of Bavaria. Recruiting troops. In 1621, Georg Friedrich began recruiting troops to campaign against the Catholic forces, which had begun a successful advance in 1620. In order not to lose his Margraviate to an imperial ban for waging war on the emperor, he abdicated in 1622, in favor of his son, Frederick V. Starting campaigns. In the spring of 1622, after the Estates granted him a special war tax for 3 years, he had between 11,000 and 12,000 mercenaries at his disposal, with a relatively large amount of artillery, in addition to the regiment that would remain behind to defend Baden. On 25 April 1622, he began a campaign against the emperor and his Catholic allies. However, he arrived too late to participate in the Battle of Mingolsheim on the 27th of April, where the Palatinate commander Count Ernst von Mansfeld crushingly defeated Lieutenant General Tilly of the Catholic League. The Battle of Wimpfen. On the 27th of April, Georg Friedrich declared war on the Habsburgs and combined his forces with those of Mansfeld, so as to fight the Catholic League together. When they were inexplicably separated a few days later, Georg Friedrich came under attack from Tilly, who was assisted by Spanish troops under Córdoba. Defeat, injuries, escape and abdication. Georg Friedrich was defeated in the Battle of Wimpfen on 6 May 1622. He was injured in the face and narrowly escaped to Stuttgart, where he abdicated in favor of his eldest son. After the Battle of Wimpfen, already on 13 May 1622, Georg Friedrich had returned to Durlach and tried in vain to raise a new army. A Catholic army of about 12,000 troops invaded Baden and devastated it thoroughly. Georg Friedrich initially fled to a stronghold at Emmendingen he had heavily fortified in the beginning of the century. On 26 August 1622, the emperor invested William, the son of Edward Fortunatus, with Baden-Baden. This meant that Baden was once again split into a Catholic Baden-Baden and a Protestant Baden-Durlach. This split would last until Baden was reunited in 1771 under Margrave Charles Friedrich. Retreat to Geneva. In 1625, Georg Friedrich retreated to Geneva, where he soon came into conflict with the Calvinist government, because he held Lutheran church services in his apartment. So in 1626 he moved to Thonus, where Duke Charles Emmanuel of Savoy allowed to hold Lutheran church services. Later appointments. In the summer of 1627 he was appointed Lieutenant General of the Danish army by King Christian IV of Denmark, who was involved in the Danish Lower Saxon War and tasked Georg Friedrich with stopping the advance of Wallenstein into northern Germany. When Wallenstein approached, Georg Friedrich withdrew to the island of Poel and then to Heiligenhafen in Holstein, marched to Oldenburg, near Wipeout and surrender. His troops from the march to Oldenburg in Holstein, where he was almost completely wiped out in the battle at the Oldenburg Gully by an imperial army under Heinrich Schlieffen, had to surrender on 24 September 1627. Resignation. In October, Georg Friedrich resigned from the Danish service after a dispute with the Danish king, who wanted to bring the issue before a court-martial. Retirement. Georg Friedrich retired to his home in Strasbourg and devoted himself mainly to the study of religious literature. He was, however, still in contact with France and Sweden, trying to realize his dream of a Lutheran Greater Baden. Death. He died on the 24th of September 1638 in Strasbourg. Burial. His body was probably transferred to the princely crypt in the S. Michael Church in Pforzheim in 1650. Marriages and issue. First marriage. Juliana Ursula of Somme-Neufville. In his first marriage, Margrave Georg Friedrich of Baden married on the 2nd of July 1592 Juliana Ursula of Somme-Neufville, daughter of the wild and Rhinegrave Frederick of Somme-Neufville. This marriage produced 15 children. Children from first marriage. Ursula Catherine, married on the 24th of August 1613 with Otto, Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel. Frederick, Margrave of Baden-Durlach from 1622 to 1659. Anna Amalia, married on the 25th of November 1615. Count William Louis of Nassau-Saarbrücken. Philip Charles, Juliana Ursula, Rudolph, Christopher, Anna August, Sibylle Magdalene, married on the 6th of June 1629. Count John of Nassau-Idstein. Francisca, Ursula Marie, Francisca Sibylle, Sophia Dorothea, Ernestine Sophie. Second marriage. Agathia of Urbich. Georg Friedrich of Baden married his second wife on the 23rd of October 1614. He married Agathe, the daughter of the Count George III of Urbich. This marriage that produced 3 children from second marriage. Agathe, Anna, Elizabeth. Third marriage. Elizabeth Stolz. Georg Friedrich of Baden's third marriage was Morganati. On the 29th of July 1621, he married Elizabeth Stolz, the daughter of his secretary, Johann Thomas Stolz. This marriage remained childless. Ancestors.